So hello everyone and welcome to DIA Talks Online. My name is Matilde Guidelli-Guidi, Associate Curator at DIA, and I am very pleased to be joined by Manuel Borja-Villel, Director of the Museo Reina Sofía in Madrid, for a conversation on Mario Merz on the occasion of the long-term display of Mario Merz's work at DIA Beacon in upstate New York and the retrospective at Reina Sofía that Manuel, you recently curated. I think Manuel, yes. So before diving in, hello Manuel. So before diving in, I wish to thank my colleagues at DIA, Andrea Villa, Maria Vogel, Max Cannon, and Teodora Lang, who helped putting together this event, and the Fondazione Merz in Turin, especially Beatrice Merz and Mariano Boggia for helping us through the installation at DIA and co-presenting today's program on their website. And a little bit of housekeeping too. Manuel and I will talk for about 40 minutes, and we want to leave time at the end for your questions. So please feel free to drop questions as we go in function that you see at the bottom of the screen. And the program is closed captioned, and you will be able to activate the function by clicking on the option, which is also in the menu at the bottom of your screen. And so now I'm pleased to formally introduce Manuel Borja-Villel, Director of Museo Nacional, Centro de Arte, Reina Sofía in Madrid. And Manolo previously served as Director of MACBA in Barcelona, and before that of the Antoni Tàpies Foundation, also in Barcelona, and among several other exhibitions and a major rehanging of the permanent collection of Reina Sofía. Manuel, you curated Antoni Tàpies, The Resources of Rhetoric, that was on view in 2009 at DIA Beacon. And he received a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Valencia in Spain and a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He lives in Madrid, where you are now. So to get us started, Manolo, of course, the occasion for our conversation today are the exhibitions of Merz at Reina Sofía and DIA, different in breadth, but happening close in time. And we thought we would start from giving our audience an overview of each exhibition and share a few curatorial considerations so that we can all orient ourselves and ground the conversation in the works. And I think one of the questions that we discussed, Manuel, is how Merz's work poses is how to install it now that the artist is no longer with us. And we discussed how you have the unique experience of having curated an exhibition of Mario with him during his lifetime and this recent, and I should add, extraordinary retrospective without him. So I'll pass it on to you now to guide us through it.
Thank you, Matilde. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to discuss Mario Merz's exhibition, which, of course, it was not, after all, I'm only the director, and the director, as everybody knows, is just there to create problems. So it's a collective work in which actually Beatrice Merz was very much involved, as also Teresa Velázquez here in the museum. And I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I'm sure that Mario would love that we talk about his work. Actually, he would like to talk. He loved to talk. Many people says that besides the fact that he had a studio, his real studio was in the bars, around a table where he discussed. And of course, he was very much involved in everything you did whenever he was working. And here we have an image of the exhibition we did at the Tàpies Foundation, an exhibition that I think has not been well distributed or known, or as much as probably ours due to the pandemic probably will remain also a little bit on view through internet and all those things. So in a way we have to substitute all that, but how to substitute, how to work without him when he was really a presence. And actually, I mean, first you have to understand how he worked. I mean, you have to understand that, of course, he had a studio, but he was working with other people. You have to understand where he comes from, the background in Torino in the late 60s, early 70s, with all these strikes around the Fiat, around Lingotto, around this great building that Le Corbusier thought it was one of the masterpieces of modern architecture, and how the opera is, all the workers' movement at the time, in a way they wanted everything. That's we vogliamo tutto. That's what they used to say, and in a way they wanted to question. They question structures. They question political structures. They wanted every day to be a Sunday, as Mario also used to say, and I think that context is very important to understand Mario, as much as it was very important to understand that he work, his knowledge, his art is always situated, is specific. Doesn't mean he's nationalistic, it means it's specific, which actually is ironical, because especially during the 90s in the Igloos, there was this whole idea of Mario's work as the artist of a nomad, which is ironical because this nomadism, it was done in relation to a national identity. And I think it was an unfortunate thing because to be a nomad, it doesn't mean that you are from nowhere. It means that you break the lines, you diffuse the borders, but it means that you work in a specific place. And we could see it here in this image because, and I'll explain a little bit, I wanted to do a tour about the exhibition we had in the Palacio Velázquez here in Reina, Sofía, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about the exhibition in Tapies Foundation, because it was quite interesting, and the way Mario was working. We did a selection of works, which of course we sent to him, and he approved more or less, but then when he came to the museum for the installation, he didn't recognize anything. He was upset. He said that that was really rubbish, and then he started moving things around, and then really one Igloo became part of another. He really changed things. And on the other hand, I mean, he didn't like the generation that Tapies represented. It was somehow the generation of artists that he thought, and Marisa, that they have overcome with their work. So it was really very ambiguous, very ambivalent about what he was doing there. Still, he loved doing it because it's like a poet. I mean, you might hate what you write, but this is the only way you know how to do it. So if you see there, he did this wall. It was kind of a spiral of kind of dry wall. And if you see these steps, those are the steps of the entrance to the foundation. So in a way, the wall, it was done so nobody could enter. In a way, it was really like having an opposition. Of course, then there was a kind of labyrinth, and it was wonderful. And this was the way he was working, a way where you had to, the spectator had to be always implied. There is also an anecdote we have there at the Tapies Foundation when we were preparing the press release, that it was a standard institutional press release, like 3 pages, and we talk about the show, about his art, and also a little bit about the biography. We show it to him. He came and he started crossing one after another all the lines, everything. And then at the end, he only left one sentence, which I think it was something like, Mario Merz is an Italian artist, something like that. And he started looking and reading. And then finally he put a comma and said, oh no. So is this, maybe this openness, this tension, I think is something that is part of the work. And it's something that whenever we work with him, I think we have to recognize, to understand it. The same way, next please. Okay, I mean, this is the Igloo Gap that was in our exhibition at the Palacio Velázquez. And actually, Caroline Christophe Barkagiev gives a kind of beautiful reading of this piece, because As you know, it has this sentence of the General Giap that says the more you concentrate, the more ground you lose, and the more you open, the less strength you have. And actually, to read it, somehow the spectator has to go around the Igloo first with small steps, because this element of concentration is on top, and then you have to go quicker. So in a way, you are embodying this kind of reading. In a way, the reading becomes, the poetry becomes alive once it happens in the real experience. And I think this is something that whenever you do a show with Mario's works, you have to take into account. So when in our exhibition, we focus on 4 points. First, relationship. Things are, what is important is not only the things, he's not an autonomous modernist artist. What is important is the relationship between the things. Second, territory. In a way, your experience is territorialized, is always inside, is in one place. And this is just the opposite of this kind of neoliberal nomadism, deterritorialized. So I think that was very important to create circuits that, and that was a concept of Germano Celan that we took, which is the idea of what we call gruppi of descenso, which senso in Italian, it has this kind of physical sense, is the idea of meaning. And then the other element, it has to do with time, in the sense, as you know, also, at one moment he suggested that all the dates should be removed of his works. So the idea, you cannot do something euchronic, you cannot do something deterritorialized, something that is outside of, in a kind of abstract time, but something that doesn't follow a chronological line. So those are the 4 points that we were having to do the organization of the show. And in the show, I hope you can see it, we have the big Igloo at the beginning, and then to my left, which I hope is everybody's left, we have in kind of brown one line, and then to the right we have another line in blue. And those are basically 2 itineraries that then they have overlaps, and then with specific elements which have to do with what we call personal or with città irreale. So the Igloo, we know, next. The Igloo, of course, is the big signature of Mario's work. In this case, is an element which occupies the space, but occupies the space again with attention. Attention that makes us alive. As after all, an Igloo is something that is at the same time concave and convex, depending if you see it from inside or you see it from outside. An Igloo, and this is, I think, is quite important, is something that is industrial, because in a way, so it refers to some kind of Fordist modernity industrial element. You have this structure that is metal, and then you have glass, and you know, but in a way, the Igloos are also the ruin of time that is gone, which is this kind of this industrial time. That, by the way, it has to make us think, as doing museography or in museums, that I remember once we showed this Igloo, when he was alive, it was full of dust, it was full of dirt, it was not really clean because it was poverino, it was pobre, it was also, it was a ruin. However, I mean, we have the tendency, actually this ultralight, I suppose he would have hated, is over clean. So that's the element, that's how conditions everything. Next. Next, please. And very often, which also these nomadistic things, the Igloo has been considered through, let's say, ethnographical elements, like if it comes from the Eskimo, probably those are references. But I think the references are closer to him, besides, I don't know, Brunelleschi, Cupel, or whatever. I think the references have a lot to do with Alba, with the place where Pinot Gallo, where the Guy Debord were constant, and we have one work of constant there, were kind of thinking this psychological geography. They were thinking about this other type of utopian constructions, where Constant was actually inspiring himself in the tents of the gypsies in the outskirts of Alba. That is, and actually some of his early paintings, you could see the relationship with Pinot Gallo. And also the Buckminster Fuller, some of the utopias of modernity, utopias that, as we saw in some of the Igloos, they are kind of, ruins. And this creates something which I think is important, which is something that an Italian critic, well known outside of Italy, called Enrico Crispolti, used to say, which is the idea of the ambiente come sociale. The idea of ambiente is a place which is at the same time physical and psychological, that goes beyond the rational cities. And that, I think, in a way, that's the Igloo. And that was what we do, the major nucleus of the foundation of the exhibition. Next. From there, we went to the house. The other element that is next to the Igloo, with this idea, also this very poetic and very ambiguous idea of the title of this work is, do we walk around the houses or the houses walk around us? Again, is this kind of psychological geography. It's also a house where you cannot enter. It's a house that is protected by kind of prehistorical animals, these animals that belong to another time, a time that which is not, is beyond history, it's prehistory. It's a time that has a different type of rhizome, and that's important. Next. Another example that was in a different, the rhinoceros in a different place of the exhibition. Next. And from there, from the Igloo to the house link, as you could see, we went to the table. The table is something also important for Mario Merz. The table is where you gather together, and talking is very important. Is where you discuss. Is part of our relationships. The table is a spiral also. It's a Fibonacci. The Fibonacci is these numbers that somehow is the opposite. The difference between Fibonacci and, let's say, a more rationalistic mathematical approach is that the Fibonacci, they are not overimpose. They don't determine the nature. They are part of it. Actually, some of the Fibonacci's could be found in snails, as he was saying. And in the table, we added, in this case, apples. And the idea of the apple is also the idea of the fruit, or is the idea of time. Apple, like in Fibonacci, there was 1, 2, 3, 5, etc., etc. And this rhizome, which again deals with time and is essential and in the work and links everything. Next. And next, related to that, in a different room, we had table Fibonacci. It's very interesting when you see these faces and these drawings, these paintings. When you see how it's designed, you can clearly see that these tables, they are not designed. They are not modernistic design. Actually, the first time, and that's why we choose precisely these ones. The first time he did a table, I mean, somebody else did it, a carpenter, and he did a drawing. But they were so low that apparently people could not sit with a chair. They had to sit on the floor. And this is very important because the tables, they are this element of gathering. They are this element that could be in a Fibonacci, a series. But what is most important there is a poetical gesture. It's a poetical element. And poetics, I mean, the scale maybe doesn't matter. So the fact that the tables at the end, they are functional is totally relevant. And I think this is very important because poetry, the poetic, is at the end of the work of Mario, and that's what we wanted to also emphasize. Next. Here again, the table from a different perspective with the raincoat over there in the other below the procession of animals that we will discuss next. And then the tables that's in Naples, in a place of workers, in a rundown place, and that gives another dimension in Mario's work, which is his social, his implication, his idea that work has to be political. But it's political not in a literary way, it's not political in a activist way. I would say, using the term of Stephen Novotny, that his work is the work of a creativist. You have to talk about creativity in the sense that he's creating, but the creation makes you to move, and this is actually quite important, and that goes into something that to me is also extraordinary in the case of Mario Merz's work. In a way, first you have to see, and that's not obvious, that he has created a typology. Tables, igloos, a typology of his own. He has created a world which is very clear situated, is in one place, but it's also his way of understanding the world. It's a language, it's a world that is modern, but at the same time is not. And I think that's somehow that relates, that's crazy, but relates to, in a way, the attitude of Mario Merz to Joyce, to Kafka, and to Borges. And I would say, I mean, of course, it's not me who's saying that, it's Borges. Borges, of course, didn't talk about Mario's work, probably because he didn't know the work. But Borges has a theory that the great modern authors are James Joyce, because he was an Irish author, and he wrote not incredibly well in English, the next, but English, it was not actually the language of his culture. So in a way, he was writing in a language that is borrowed. The same thing with Kafka in terms of German, and the same thing, of course, so for him, the three best literatures in the world were Irish, Czech, and of course Argentinian, because also Argentina is in the periphery, so in a way it was not Spanish from Spain. So in a way, this element of what Deleuze and Guattari mentioned, minor literature, minor quote, is in Mario Merz's work. In a way, he uses elements that have to do with modernity, that in a way you maybe recognize in other artists. The idea of neon maybe is in Bruce Nauman, in Kossuth, but he does it in a totally different way, in a way that is kind of peripheral, if you will. Next. The Igloo again, so we go in the other direction. Next. Of course, and then we had also the Igloo Fibonacci, the idea of the Fibonacci as a structure that creates everything. Next. And we go into the other side where you see the Igloo Giap. Next. And I thought I had, and the Igloo of the tent of Gaddafi. Next, I think I have, okay. I just wanted to show you here the next elements where you have two igloos that clearly they are more political in this sense, next to another elements that somehow reflects next his political position. At the end, you see these neon sentences that says, general strike, political action relative, proclaimed relatively to art. Next, maybe we can see it closer. Maybe next. Yeah. And so this is actually quite interesting in many ways, First, the use of text, which it becomes very important. And normally he does it kind of handwriting. In this case, is kind of in capital letters. It's one of the few times he does it. But this is maybe because he's kind of calling to the action, to the creativity again, because after all, is relatively proclaimed in art. I think this is quite important. Next. And we had that next to the declaration, the human rights of men and of the citizen, with the newspapers, which again links whatever he does to certain actuality, and actuality which is dated in the next moment. Next. And that is something which is important, because we keep on talking about literature, about poetry, and poetry writing. We know he wrote a lot. It was very important in his text. We know that the influence of the poems of Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot, this is Città Irreale. Città Irreale has to do with the love song of Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. This kind of city where things, in a way, you are isolated. And against that, he contraposes this utopian igloo. Next. Also his relationship with nature. You have this house in the forest, which could be a nest, it could be a refuge. Next. No, can you go backwards? Actually, I didn't see it in my... Okay, I don't see it in my screen, but I think you have Pittore in Africa there, which I think is really a great piece, because there, in a way, you have a summary, you have enigma. You have why the work of Mario Merz is so poetic, enigmatic in the deep sense of the work. Here you have what it could be maybe like a canvas. The only thing is that is done with mesh, is done in a way that is kind of industrial, if you like, of an industry that is already long time past. You have a reference to Africa, the continent that for Hegel had no history. You have a reference to a continent, to whatever a landscape, but for him, it's not that you can represent landscape or nature is something separated of yourself. It's something that is, you are part of it. That's also why we think his work becomes so interested. And in a way, through the dematerialization of the neon of the text and the materiality of the let's say the canvas, I think you have this tension, this poetic element, which I think is quite relevant. And that brings us almost to the end. Next. Yeah, that was next behind the igloo, and behind the igloo we had two elements. One, the raincoat, and then che fare, the question, what to do, the question that in a way he proposed himself every time he did an exhibition. We have to propose ourselves. In a way, the visitor has to ask themselves. It's a way also questioning where we are. And there it becomes many elements which are very interesting. On the one hand, this biographical element, but it's not biographical in a mythological, in this idea of the big hero, big genius. It's not biographical in this also idiotic sense, like, for example, some interpretations of Picasso, where this painting is related to Dora Maar, this painting is related to Maria Therese. Is biographical because it's his raincoat. Is biographical because the work is biographical, but it's biographical because in a way biography is the house, biography is our relationship with the other, and biography is the transit, is moving from one place to another. And this is Mario's work, the basis, and this is somehow the thesis, quote thesis, I mean, because the exhibition is not discursive. This is more or less what we try to convey in the exhibition. And in this case, we have another element which I think is also very important, with this, the neon crossing the raincoat, that in a way it makes it like a ghost. And this is also quite important, and I think it's a statement of him in the sense that the life of a person ends, but the work as a ghost lives many lives. Works as, I mean, that's the problem. Somebody said recently, the problem of America is not that Trump is gone, is that Trumpism is still there. So in a way, he knows that. He knows that enunciations, art, live many lives. And this is somehow what the Raincoat, this element of autobiographical is there. And the next image is we did, because drawing, it was so important. We did a room with drawings, next, in which, in a way, this biography too, but in the sense of what Willem Flusser, the Brazilian philosopher, used to say, the gesture. The gesture of the pleasure of writing for birds, the pleasure of drawing, the drawing that he did continuously, a drawing that, as we could see there, is his own hand, a hand which is a Fibonacci, because, and actually he drew it very often. A hand is 1 + 1, 2, 2 + 1, 3, 3 + 2, 5, the 5 fingers. So in a way, this human scale, this biographical element, this element that has to do with the territorializing our experience, which has to do with drawing, with poetry, is actually what we wanted to convey with this exhibition. And I just hope that he would have liked it, comma, or not. Thank you.
So thank you, Manolo. So we move now. I have many questions already, but I think we can move now quickly to the next slide, and we can talk about the exhibition at the Beacon, which of course is different in format from a retrospective, in that typical of Beacon, displays remain on view long term to allow for repeated visits and pairings, and each gallery is monographic. And in the broader scope of the programming, the exhibition of Merz opens up the canon of North American and German art of the 60s and 70s, which constitute the core of Dia's holdings, through geographical lines, and reciprocally, hopefully, will bring a different vantage point on the period through resonances and frictions. So for those who are familiar with the Beacon, the museum is a former factory, which brings us back, Manolo, from where you started. So the space and the different layers of industrialization and post-industrialization. And it is organized architecturally on a modular grid. And Merz's exhibition is installed, as we can see here, in one of Beacon's longitudinal corridors, which has 3 points of entrance facing, as we see here, a long wall of windows. So next slide. So the display is built around recent acquisitions. And as you were saying, Manolo, certainly Merz developed typologies. So thinking typologically about the works were selected to offer a representation of the key themes and forms that Merz has developed. And so what we see here in this portion of the exhibition, we did 2 works on the left and the right, the hay bale pierced by neon and the Teatro Cavallo, the horse theater, so the juxtaposition of the agricultural, the animal, and the technological. And to the back of the corridor, we see the Igloo form, an early use of it, that at first, in his early use of the form, it was self-contained and autonomous. And then the Fibonacci progression, so that we see different ways in which Merz used it. On one way, grafting onto the beams of the Beacon, and then used as a rhythm or structure for the work on the far end wall, which, as you can see, are worker aprons that are spaced according to the Fibonacci progression. And then next slide. At the center of the exhibition is a later Igloo from the 80s, where often the form grew, and also grafting into one another and juxtaposing again both opaque and transparent forms. So the glass Igloo, as you said, the glass dome, the signature form of Merz, and then the opaque dome of twigs, and then nested within it, previous slide, and then nested within it instead an igloo covered in tar, which of course brings us back to the question of also different materials and in the industrial materials discarded, and as well as a geological time, of course, fossil fuels, and the work to the right called Prehistoric Wind, Vento Preistorico dalle Montagne Ghiacciate. So bringing in the question, both in the title and in the work, of a different temporality, as you brought up earlier on, Manolo, the question of different temporalities and a long-term, an evocation of prehistory, not only in the title, but also in the materials. So next slide. And then as we recede in the corridor, we return to the other key element of the table. So if the igloo would be reimagining, dwelling, the table is, as you said, the core element of sociability, but also work. And then the two larger installations of the 80s, so the spiral table that we see here in the slide and the larger igloo in the back, are kind of grounded by an early painting that we see on the left wall, and that has this brings us back to the 50s and the kind of this genealogy of Merz's relationship to Cobra and Pinot Galizio as well, and the question of how a same image or a same work can hold together and coexist in the same space, both the animal, the vegetal, and the human in that. So from a curatorial standpoint, on the one hand, beside the choice of the works in order to go through all the different typologies and themes of the practice, on the one hand, something that you mentioned, Manolo, that was very important to think through was the works accommodate a multiplicity of materials and temporalities and cultural references rather than embracing one dominant perspective. But on the other hand, one thing that I think is very important is that the work, Merz's work, keep those different ideologies in tension. So one question was how to keep those relations active within the work, but also within the space of the exhibition and within the broader collection. So one way to do so was through placement and to situate Merz's forms in tension with the Cartesian space of the building. And as an example, just to pick one example I mentioned here, in particular, the centerpiece, the larger Igloo 853 that we placed at the center in a similar way as in the Reina Sofía, in that, as Merz would say, it grows and is measured from inside out. So it has this centrifugal energy, so that the other works all of it become kind of satellite and already generates a tension between the works in the space. And then next slide, the glass dome, which of course, as we said, is the signature of Merz, pushes into the corridor that traverses the museum east-west, so that it announces itself, but also unsettles and creates tension with the Cartesian grid of the architecture. And finally, next slide, another question in terms of like placement and orientation was materials. So using materials, it would say real materials rather than metaphorical. And so in this case, as we can see, the twigs igloo is slightly off-center towards the window, in that twigs and branches are naturally attracted to sunlight. So the question, maybe next slide. Yes, so orientation was important as thinking through how to keep the work in active tension with the space, but not only from a material point of view, but also from a conceptual standpoint. So another example is the Fibonacci progression that we grafted onto the beams of the beacon. And we can see here how did Merz use the Fibonacci progression in architecture. I think there's always this ambivalence. On one hand, there's the irony of the numbers. So counting the beams makes the building look silly in a way because of the strategy of distancing and almost like estrangement that all of a sudden happens as an effect of counting. But at the same time, and this is where orientation becomes important, the progression grows from inside out. So if we were standing in the galleries right now, from the vantage point of these photographs, behind us, we would have the exit of the building. So the work is at once irony of numbers to distancing, creating this distance from the kind of phenomenological space of the building, but at the same time a threat, as Merz would say, of the collective energy that gains cumulative power with the proliferation of the sequence. And then next slide, I think. Yes. So, and we can see a similar concept in the suite of worker aprons that are instead in the back wall on the opposite side of the exhibition that are spaced according to the Fibonacci sequence. So in this case, the sequence is used not in itself, but as a structure and rhythm for the installation. And we can see maybe that the aprons kind of exceed the space of the gallery because, again, to imply this tension with the architectural space of the building. This kind of question of space and the tension of space, I think, is dramatized in the work that we see in the foreground in this slide, which is an early Igloo that poses a question, similarly to the work that you presented earlier. The question that the work poses in its title is space bent or straight? So the juxtaposing curved space, which would be the space of ideas and more like a speculative and non-productive space, to the straight or Cartesian space that we could say is traditionally used for the tabulation of value, so, and therefore productivity. So, but I think one thing that was important to keep in tension in the exhibition, and both in the works and then in the way it was installed, was how these two ideologies are kept in tension. And I think, as you were saying earlier, the question of the precariousness of the glass in this Igloo, I think, is particularly evident because the glass is held together by what in Italy we call mastice or patti, which of course has a certain kind of resistance, but at the same time it also is fairly precarious. So I think next slide. Yes, so the other question was not only how to keep the tension and that kind of active juxtapositions within the work and within the space of Merz's exhibition, but also how then it would open up affinities and maybe frictions with the works installed at DIA. So one example is on the longitudinal corridor adjacent to Merz. Currently on view is Mel Bochner's measuring room, which is a work that uses standard measurement in order to measure aspects of the architecture. So it's kind of close in time to Merz's aprons that we see at the end of the slide, and therefore the tension happens in which they were works that were created kind of at the same time or conceptualized kind of the same time in the late 60s, early 70s, and thinking through way of measuring and mediating space. But of course, as you highlighted before, the difference between using the Fibonacci algorithm versus standard measurements. So next slide. Yes, another relationship, of course, this is a bit cheating because of course the spiral jetty, Smithson spiral jetty is not in Beacon, but one of the key works that DIA maintains and that I wanted to bring up because of the tension, the question of the work existing in a force field and questions of entropy and of course the spiral form, as well as I would say the question of prehistory, which was important for Smithson very much as for Merz, but in a different way. But next slide. yes, the other aspect is, as you were saying earlier, Manolo, the question of language and the use of language. And the juxtaposition here is with a work by Lawrence Weiner, which is in the back of the Beacon building. And I think similarly, they use language to represent material relationships. And each time the words are not only remade, but also renewed. So of course, objet cache-toi is a sentence, it's kind of a graffiti that Merz took from an anonymous writing on the wall, and that generates a material relationship with the glass dome of the building and the twigs. So both the tension with the natural material and then the dissolution of light into the glass dome, whereas for Weiner would be the question of kind of almost site-specific enumeration of materials. And then in the next slide, a moment of friction, which somehow returns to what you were saying, Manolo, about the question of the subaltern and the relationship with Judd and American minimalism. So on the left is, of course, the Igloo that we just saw, is space bent or straight with Mario inside the Igloo, and then to the right is Judd boxes that are currently on view in Beacon. So maybe a next, we can stay on this slide, or I see that, as I expected, we are running, we are already for 15 minutes close to the end. So there were a few things, Manolo, that we had discussed we would want to touch upon. And one of the points was the relationship to American minimalism, which, but the other question maybe we wanted to touch upon was the title of your exhibition, so Time is Mute. And so I leave it to you.
Okay. And since now I see your exhibition, which I have not seen, so I will also maybe comment
yes.
a few things, because actually both exhibitions are very different. In a way, ours, it was, I mean, not in a way, it was focused on Mario. Yours, because also is in the Velázquez Palace, is a building that belongs to the museum, but it's not in the museum, it's in the park. So in a way, it's isolated. And in your case, clearly, you have other artists, so this relationship is there all the time. So I think but there are elements that come through everything. On the one hand, is this idea of silence in a way that is also in the work. I mean, how important are the things in between, and to do that in a way when you curate a show, more than doing just, let's say, a cartography, a map, you have to do a diagram, which is more dynamic, thinking about the objects, the elements, but also thinking about places where there is nothing, where one thing crosses to another. I think somehow I found that in both exhibitions. And silence, it has to do with the Time is Mute, which is a sentence by him. Of course, this is the way we wanted to try to work with him, and it has to do first with this hatrans of euchronism, of chronology, of time, of date, which is in a way of making categories. I mean, he built a typology, but he didn't follow them. I mean, it was his world, but he was changing it all the time. And then time is mute in the sense that is a time which is prehistorical. In a way, is pre-writing. In a way, is a time that has to talk. It's a time that we have to, the spectator has to bring alive. So in a way, the works, either they are alive, make alive by the visitor, by the performic act of reading it, or otherwise is absolute mute, being mute. So that's why we decided to to use this title.
But I think the question of, I mean, to me at least, and I kind of juxtapose these slides together, because one thing that I think is interesting as well is what happens if the work managed to append different temporalities. So in the case, for instance, the time is mute, and being against the chronology is also breaking with linear progress. So in linear progress, the animal, the horsepower is kind of left behind vis-a-vis the instead technological power. So I think there are several instances in which these times are presented as coterminous in a way. So we have it throughout. And one question that I think would be interesting to think about how relevant the work is today is, of course, we're discussing a lot question of crisis, but we can say that the work puts forth really a vision in which the crisis is chronic under capitalism. So the question of chronic crisis that is inherent and embedded bring us inevitably to question of ecology, which is something that today we are all living. We are all home because of the pandemic, which is inevitably a consequence of both excessive extraction, deforestation, and globalization at the same time. So the question of breaking with linear progress also, in a way, breaks with question of immediate emergency and inserts us in this longer chronology and this longer crisis, which is chronic.
Actually, when we thought about doing the exhibition at the time that the idea of doing a Mario Merz exhibition came, here we were working a lot or discussing the ideas of Bruno Latour or Donna Haraway, and I think this element, in a way, I think his work makes lots of sense. The way he thinks in relation to nature, where there is not something that you impose. I mean, the numbers, the way you relate is makes you to be part of it. I mean, he's not something that is he's not different of nature. Actually, I think he mentions it in some interview, and also the way of the refuge of the Igloo. There are things that I mean he could have done today. But I mean, the fact that he was a militant anti-fascist, I mean, he would be totally up to date again. But it's also interesting if we understand where he comes from. Actually, he comes from a period which is all these strikes in Torino, is again the situationist, is in a way is at the origin of many of the things that we are doing. So all that is there, and is there in a sense of melancholy, which is not nostalgic. I mean, but there is some element, I think, of again working with tools which are the tools of there is an element of anachronism in his work. There is a painting of the 50s, I think, where he's a soldatore, he's a welder. And apparently is interpreted as a self-portrait. Of course, he was portrayed himself as a welder when a society of spectacle is coming, where things are changing totally, where the idea of the welder or the factory is already something from the past. So it's always, to me, this element of being outside of time, which I think is part of the work.
Yeah. So we have 5 more minutes, and I see that we have a few questions. And the first one is actually ties with what you were just talking about, Manolo. So maybe you want to answer this. You mentioned Pinot Gallo, and I was not aware that our guest says, I was not aware that Merz would have known him. And whether you can speak about that relationship a little more.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Pinot Gallo was a fantastic, incredible everything. I mean, what he did, and I think for what I read and what Mario said, probably he felt, and also Mario was very young at the time, he felt probably very attracted by a person that he was a painter, and actually there are some elements, even in color, that of course has to do with Cobra and all those things.
Yeah.
That's how when you see some of the paintings that are still, I think it's in the City Hall on the theater in Alba, in a theater, I think, in a way they remind you of the early paintings by Mario Merz. But Pinot Gallo, he was also a chemist, a pharmacist. Yeah. He was a major. He was an organizer of events. He was a huge person. And somehow all these, he was also doing industrial paintings that he cut. So I think all those elements, to me, I think probably were an influence. And again, many people talks, of course, about the Igloo being with the nature of the Eskimo, whatever. But again, at the time, Constant was doing those nebulae, was doing all these things around Alba, and the idea of this kind of mental geography, I think that's there. So to me, I think that's, I mean, not one origin, because then it's still the readings, is many things, but I think that's one element which is important and is specific of Mario, and actually has little to do with this identity of Italian art that was being proposed in the 80s, especially with this exhibition that Germano Cellan, the second, or Germano Cellan, not the Germano Cellan of the 60s, 70s, when he did the Knot in PS1, where he kind of tried to put all these Italian artists and to make kind of a general threat to all of them. I mean, of course, Alba was one of the elements of Mario, but his work was about disruption, I think, more than about continuity.
Yeah, and so of course, what you just mentioned, that is one of the big tensions that, in a way, or paradoxes that the exhibitions of the 80s and 90s, both of Merz and Arte Povera in general, bringing in this question of the nomadic, but paradoxically lining it with a made in Italy or Italian identity question. So I think one thing that, of course, your exhibition did, and that this exhibition at DIA hopefully will do, is to bring in a different by reinstating Merz in his genealogy, also presenting, and as well as in dialogue with artists of his generation, presenting this different point of view more completely. Let me see other questions. There's many questions, but this one, I think we touched upon. Yeah, it seems like we covered most of it, Manolo. So I think, given that we have 1 minute left, I think I will just thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you have, yes, please, if you have anything other that we want to bring up, but otherwise, I think this was fantastic and it was great. I feel like I'm one of the few people who saw both exhibitions, so I feel very privileged.
So at least yours will be for a while, so we can see it. I just wanted to add something which, while you were talking, I don't know, it came to my mind. As I said, in the Tapis Foundation, the exhibition, he was kind of on and off, upset, not upset, because, and actually Bruno Corà, he did an interview, and the interview is really something that is worth it to read, because it shows Mario was very upset. But there is the first question that he already complains about, which I think is very interesting, because Bruno, very polite, asked him something, I forgot the exact question, is like, one would like to know, or it would be important to know about your work, and he's very upset, and he says, not it, you. Are you interested or you are not? So I think this personal element, I think, is quite important. So that would be my recommendation to everybody that goes to DIA, to get involved.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.